Well, thank you very much for coming to today's forum. I'm Johan de Cleer from the System Sciences Lab at PARC, a research fellow here. I've known Brian for many years, decades. By the way, he's getting rid of the beard. Anyways, what? Yeah, right. Anyways, when I first got to know him, in the context of he had written some articles on how how architectural lock-in gets you increasing returns, which seems obvious in retrospect, but gave a lot of insight and still what drives many Silicon Valley companies, the success of Silicon Valley today, or actually the desire of architectural lock-in. I've had many lunches with Brian. I think one of the things he brings so uniquely, he's in part historian, part economist, and part technologist. And you can talk about anything. I discovered one. I'll tell you something that gets him most excited. We were debating this book, which forget about the quality of the book, but it's called Why the West Won. It's the 6 killer apps of Western civilization. And it was very English-centric, and he just went straight down what the English did to the Irish. He said, they did not even allow us to own a horse. Anyways, that was interesting. He's always fun, and I expect this talk to be very, very fun as well. He's usually right, and sometimes he's wrong, but he's always provocative and interesting. He has many honors. I'm not going to go through his CV, just bolster his narcissism. But he has 3 roles today. He's a visiting scientist here at PARC. He's part of the Santa Fe Institute, and he's also at the Nanyang Technological University, Singapore. And I'll add one more thing. I was surprised. It was great. You've been nominated for the Nobel Prize in Economics 3 times. So congratulations. And next time you got to take me out to dinner if you win. Okay, right. In Stockholm. Yeah, I'll go.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Johan. And thanks to all of you for coming. I'm surprised to see and delighted to see faces that I haven't seen in many years, and including 2 of my children that I've seen even more recently than that. So what I want to talk about today is where the digital revolution is taking us. Everybody has a different take on this, and I'm very well aware that I'm at PARC, where people are not only wondering where the digital revolution's going, but they're part of the digital revolution. They're causing the digital revolution. A lot of what I have to say here will be very familiar to people at PARC. So think of it this way. I'm talking about some of the jigsaw pieces that everybody's familiar with here, but how do you put them together into a coherent picture? And the tool I'm going to use mostly is, as Johan hinted, I want to use economic history. It's funny, but if you want to see what the future is going to look like in technology, the best thing is to look at history. Not at economic theory. Economic theory just thinks in the short term. Here's the machine, here's how it works, but they don't show you the larger picture of things coming and going. Anyway, so what I want to do is talk about where we're heading with the digital revolution. Not so much technologically, people know a lot about that here in this audience, but to do with industry, how this is going to affect the economy, how it's going to affect society, and even maybe a conjecture or two how it will change our outlook or our philosophy even. By the way, there's been an awful lot of journalistic thought. In fact, I came talking about journalistic thought. There was an article I read in the Atlantic Monthly on just this subject, where's artificial intelligence taking us, by none other than Henry Kissinger. And what surprised me was he wasn't too far off the target, even if he's in his 90s. So there's been a lot of conjecture about this, a lot of talk about automation in the economy, about robotics, about 3D printing, the cloud, AI, machine learning. All of these things have their champions. I don't have a particular champion, but I'll be talking a lot about artificial intelligence here. There's also a kind of opposition party, a very good economist called Robert Gordon at Northwestern, and he insists that, he says, the computer revolution reached its climax in the 1990s, around the time of the dot-com bubble. Personally, I don't believe it. In fact, I think that's an outrageous statement. And I think that economists who comment on the digital revolution ought to live in one of the two coasts of America, but more particularly the West Coast, if they want to understand what's going on here. So there's lots of conjectures, and my guiding light's going to be history. I did give a PARC Forum. The last one I gave was a long time ago. In 2011, I'd written an article in the McKinsey Quarterly. I called it The Second Economy. And I pointed out, this was 7 years ago, that there was a second economy. I should have called it the autonomous economy or the virtual economy. It was getting rather large even then, but people weren't much talking about it. And I pointed out that this economy was huge, it was vast, silent, invisible, and always on, and it was configuring itself, and it was self-healing and self-correcting. And that caused quite a lot of stir. A lot of people said, yep, this is on target. The metaphor I used was that it reminded me of an aspen forest. An aspen forest is a peculiar thing. It's not just any old forest, but the individual trees in this aspen forest that are visible to the eye, they're above the ground. Think of that as the physical economy. I don't know if I can get a pointer to work here. No. So think of the trees as the companies or the activities in the physical economy, but beneath the earth, there's an interconnected root system in an aspen forest. Not just individual roots, but an aspen forest is one huge organism with all the roots connected below the earth. And it seemed to me what we were moving into was a physical economy, and then the virtual economy or the autonomous economy was all interconnected with servers talking to servers, with everything in communication with everything else. And on top of that, it would report back to the physical economy once in a while. That was 2011, and things changed. The year of change is 2012, apparently. I'm not so sure, because if you know enough techie history, you can always say, oh yeah, but you know, somebody in Germany had a version of this in 1922 or whatever it is. But let's say 1 year after this, for point of discussion here, things changed. Something happened, and that's what I want to talk about. But let me build up to that. There's a lot of talk about the fourth industrial revolution coming from the World Economic Forum. Professor Klaus Schwab, who runs the World Economic Forum and has had teams of people thinking about this. As you'll see, I don't see this as an industrial revolution. I think it's something very different. So I want to start just with the digital revolution, and to my mind, it's continually changing. It looks continuous if you work somewhere like here. But as I see it, the theme of it keeps changing, it keeps morphing. So let's start around 1970. There was plenty of computation before that, but arbitrarily start 1970, about when the integrated circuit came out, Intel, etc., and PARC, by the way, in his great days then. And this is when we got serious commercial computation, IBM, and then in due course, within 10 years or so, personal computers. Then from about 1990 to 2010, the theme shifted, and it wasn't so much that we could do all this wonderful computation, it was that everything was getting connected via satellites or fiber optic cable, the erbium-doped photon amplifier, all kinds of things. But it was basically the age of the internet, and then laterally the cloud. So this was the great age of interconnection, and that was the age when globalization really got going. Because if you want to get your supplier supplying you from China or from Mexico, you need to know every moment who's doing what and have pretty well real-time communications. So globalization took off once we got this amazing interconnection. The next phase, as I see it, is, and this is the age we're in right now, from about 2010, we got sensors. I remember sitting on a wall, actually in 2010, with the CTO of Intel, a guy called David Tennenhouse. You might know him. He's an affable character. We were just exchanging ideas. I said, when are we going to get really cheap sensors down to 10 cents a go? Things that say you drive your car up to a slot with a little parking meter, and the parking meter can sense whether there's a car in that parking spot or not. One little sensor. I said, when will that go below 10 cents? He gave me a really accurate answer. He says, it's happening now. He says, by 2013, all of that will be there. So we did get sensors. They're in your smartphone, they're in your car, they're everywhere you go. They're all over the place, and they're sensing everything, pressures, blood chemistry. They're sensing temperatures, they're sensing movement, they're sensing pixels. And so when sensors came along, we got vast amounts of data. So this is when big data arrived, around about 2010 and the years since. But certainly about 2012, everybody was talking about big data from all the sensors. And that was crying out in turn for someone to make sense out of all of this. If you had a lot of data on faces, could you come up with algorithms that would recognize those faces and say, oh, wow, that's the face of a cat. This one's the face of, it's always Jennifer Aniston who figures in these examples. That one's Jennifer Aniston. Could we make sense of all this data? If we had pixels that were looking down a street, could we say that's a pedestrian? Well, that's a picture of a pedestrian on a billboard. This one's a dog. Oh, that's a dog running across the road. Here's where the road is actually going. If we could solve that problem, we could get cars that could drive themselves. And we did solve these problems. So what we got was algorithms that could use all the data that was getting collected by sensors. I'm simplifying a lot, but these algorithms were quite a surprise. You know plenty about deep learning. GPUs, graphic processing units, were very important. It was important also that we had much faster computers that could compute things extraordinarily fast. But what happened was we got, from all this, we got algorithms that could take all this data and get trained on the data and suddenly start to recognize things. The surprising thing was that there was a shift in how things were done. To do this, somebody, I would have said 20 years ago, oh, we're going to need a lot of logical processing. We're going to understand what it is, say, to do some of these things. Let me just point out what's been done. Face recognition is reasonably routine. Speech recognition, it's okay if you speak American English or if you speak English, but if you're somewhere from, it doesn't work that wonderfully well always, but it's not too bad. Natural language processing, which we've done a lot of here. Inductive inference, think in terms of the quiz program Jeopardy. You're given a rather strange clue and you have to make all sorts of inductions. Computer vision, I wouldn't say any of these things are routine. Conversational intelligent agents, that's being worked on here at PARC. So there's a lot of things have been done. Machine translation. What was really surprising was that none of these things were done using models, or very little models. We didn't start saying, oh yeah, I want to translate from Chinese to English, or vice versa. If I do that, I'd better understand Chinese. I need to understand Chinese grammar. I need to understand exceptions. If it's English, I need to understand strong verbs. This had been done for decades. It didn't work very well. What happened around 2012, a bit before that and a bit afterwards, was an enormous use of data. If you want very sophisticated statistical techniques, but they were amounted to just solving the problem by sheer data. In the case of machine translation, for example, what people did was the Hong Kong legislature needs to write down all speeches in English and same speeches in Chinese. And if it's spoken Chinese, possibly Cantonese and Mandarin as well. But if it's written Chinese, there were all these records in the UN and the EU of the same speech being given in more than one language. So what people did, what the engineers did, was they just took equal sentences and they built up banks of millions or hundreds of millions of sentences in Chinese or in English, same sentence. Then when you have a new sentence, computer very quickly associates one of the sentences in its dictionary with something pretty close that you're feeding in and gives you pretty closely the Chinese version out. This was a huge surprise. A lot of people like me thought it was terribly inelegant. I'd been properly trained. Where was the thought behind this? Where was all the symbolic logic? Where was the grammar? It wasn't. It was just all kludged together, and it all worked fairly well. Google Translate actually works surprisingly well. So that was a surprise that it was basically just saying, we're going to take all these pixels and by dint of rather clever algorithms, but with no understanding whatever of what faces look like, we will keep extracting features and features and features. What computers were learning to do was association. And what emerged from all of this was what you'd call associative intelligence. Now think of it, what we were really talking about was artificial intelligence. That never quite came through in the sort of proper sense of really being able to reproduce how human beings think. But it did come through if you were just saying, I'm going to show you a lot of sensory inputs. We get them on the back of our retina. We get them on our retinas, back of our eye. And through that we can say, oh yeah, that's so-and-so, that's Uncle Jim. We managed to teach computers the same trick. So the sort of intelligence that's talked about here is associative intelligence. Suddenly computers could do what humans could do, and that's association. You could say that's not intelligence, but I spent a lot of time looking at cognition or cognitive psychology. And one definition of intelligence that biologists are keen on is to say, if you get a certain amount of sensory input, how do you appropriately respond to that? So an E. coli bacterium gets the sensory input, it's floating around in a solution, say, of glucose. It detects that there's a gradient, there's more glucose over here in the liquid than there is down there. And it can tumble or automatically swim towards the higher gradient, towards more concentration of glucose. And that's appropriate. Can you say the bacterium's intelligent? I don't know. I wouldn't say it has a brain. How can you say it's intelligent? But it's doing something smart. That's really what we were teaching computers to do. Okay, I see this sentence in English. I have a record of something like that said in English before, and a record of the Chinese translation. And with a bit of twiddling, I'll give you back something appropriate that's Chinese to that. So really, what we were doing was recognition or intelligence, and being able to do that with machines. And I think this is quite remarkable, and this caught many, many people by surprise. It caught me by surprise, because I remember we used to say, this is years ago in Berkeley, my PhD advisor was Stuart Dreyfus. His brother was Hubert Dreyfus, who was very famous for saying, machines will never be intelligent. And we used to say, machines, computers, are really good at something that humans aren't good at. Calculation, logical deduction, you can build all that in, and almost instantaneously you get something correct out. We humans are not good at that. What are we good at? We're good at association. We smell something, we say, somebody's cooking chocolate chip cookies. Computers couldn't do that, and we thought they never could. So computers would never be as smart as us, and white-collar jobs consisted, not entirely, but very much, of people making judgments. Oh, I see that person. I'm sitting in a bank, I'm a bank manager. I look at the record, I know the family, I think, oh, I'm not sure I'm going to give them a loan. So I'm doing a lot of associative work. We thought we were clever, computers would never get there, and the huge surprise, I think, since 2010, maybe some people could see it coming, the huge surprise is that became rather routine with neural networks, deep learning, GPUs, etc. I want to say a word or two about this intelligence. This is an illustration I found on the internet. It won't surprise anyone here. Think of these as driverless cars. Think of, I don't know what highway this would be. It's not the 405 in Los Angeles, but it's somewhere that looks like around here. This intelligence, we tend to think of intelligence as having a central brain or a central controller. Imagine it's 2025, maybe even 2022, and we have this sort of thing in California. All these vehicles are driverless. What's likely to happen is that they're all in communication with each other. They're all using algorithms. This car might be in communication with the bus behind, which is in communication with what's in front of it as well and what's to the side. And so what you're having is all of these intelligences talking to each other, and they're all mutually adjusting. And what's coming out overall in the traffic is proper separation, proper speeds, something that you would call appropriate. But notice there is no central controller in this example. There's absolutely no controller that's saying this is the way it has to happen, this is the way it has to be done. It's not that the highway controller, someone in Los Angeles, would have some huge computer the size of PARC telling each car how to adjust. So suddenly the church which had all the power of information up until 1450 or so, began to lose power, and power of information started to flow towards individuals. This is Copernicus, and this is almost a century later, 1543. His book is De Revolutionibus Orbium Cella, whatever, on the revolutions of heavenly bodies. 1453, he died the day before the book came out, very conveniently. It wasn't that he planned it that way. His followers waited. As soon as he was properly dead, the next day they brought out his book. He had it ready to go. What I want to point out is that Copernicus, and this was probably the most influential book of the 1500s, and set the whole scene for Galileo and Newton and other people, he couldn't have produced his work without printed material. He could not have done it without other printed books. All his source material was printed. Similarly, there's another hero of mine, actually, Martin Luther. And Martin Luther, I'm not, of course, he overthrew the church, but if you look at the philosophy behind this, is if we were thinking not that the church has all the power, but individuals have power, and there's individual rationality, what would be our relation to God? So again, a shift into individualism. There were a couple of 100,000 pamphlets produced and printed, and this took over Europe, and we had the Protestant Reformation. So you could say that the beginnings of science required printing, the beginnings of a change in the power of the church was a consequence of printing, and more than anything, a reliance on individual rationality was very much a consequence of printing. None of that is captured, by the way, in GDP. I have a friend, Douglas Robertson, who has thought and written a lot about this. Doug says, just quite simply, printing gave us our modern world. You could, in between, you could say printing, without much exaggeration and allowing for a few other causes, gave us our modern world. The reason I'm going into printing is that printing, you can think of it as the arrival of information that was accessible to us. And that caused all these changes. Did it cause the modern world? Yeah, I think so. If you start to argue that, say, in 1450 or 1400, no country had printing or was using printing, and Western Europe was a backwater. China was much more advanced civilization, so was India, so was Persia, so were the Arabian countries, and one or two others. None of them took up printing. The Middle Eastern ones banned it, and Europe pulled quite far ahead, and the result in some way was what we now call modernity. So the printing revolution brought external information which had an enormous consequence in the West. This current revolution is not, I've read a lot of sources saying it's bringing us much more information squared and cubed. It's not, it's bringing us not just information that's outside us, but an intelligence that's outside us. And this is something new. And I don't think there's going to be an upper bound to this. It's not as if you could say, such a revolution's done. It's 2050, oh, we've got all the external intelligence we're ever going to get. It's like saying we've got all the external information we're ever going to get. How would that affect industry? I'm going to go a lot faster here and say, well, we have a new set of technologies. We have all this external intelligence. It's external to our craniums. It's external to us as human beings. It's out there in the cloud, or it's out there somehow in the technosphere. We can bring in all that intelligence if we want. Standard economics would say that industry adopts the new technology. Not quite, it's a bit more subtle. Industries don't quite adopt this huge new technology, they encounter it. They run up against it, and two things happen. Pieces of the Lego set of the new technology, face recognition, voice recognition, being able to encrypt things, those pieces are encountered by pieces of the industry. And then completely new combinations result. And the industry re-architects itself. Second thing that happens is new structures form that can be used, and those new structures are components. So blockchain that you've heard about, cryptocurrencies, even convoys of trucks, if you regard them as a new structure, encryption systems, proprietary data, all of these things become new pieces in the Lego set that particular industries can build upon. I'll bypass the blockchain and just illustrate this with one industry, retail banking. So think of your Wells Fargo bank or any other bank. Retail banking is simply there, and it's transforming very fast. It will be very shortly in the future. If you want a mortgage, you can apply online. If you're in China, you can apply using WeChat. It will recognize your voice and say, I want a mortgage for, oh, let's be very modest and say 1-bedroom apartment, so I'm going to need $1.5 million if it's Silicon Valley, fraction if it's in Ohio, and an algorithm, intelligent algorithm settles the issue. What about personal finance, financial advice, retirement advice? Algorithm will be advising you. This is not far away. In fact, we're in the middle of this sort of transition. What about personal loan? I saw this in action in Shenzhen last year. I watched somebody use WeChat, call up their bank, WeBank, and say, I would like $750. I'm a bit short of money. I don't know if that much is in my account. Kindly let me know. Voice recognized, their credit history recognized, all sorts of conversations with creditors. Less than 2 seconds later, they had the money. So this is moving very fast. There's another side to it, and that's called fintech or financial technology. So banking is going techie and going more artificially intelligent. Fintech is coming from the techie side and meeting banking. And the result is that you get two things in the middle that are intermeshing. It's not clear to me whether the techie firms are going to win or the banking firms are going to win. I think we're going to get a mixture of both, and then things will settle out, but it'll take about 15 years. Point I want to make here is that the theme in the old economy, I'm thinking of Paul Samuelson's economy, 1950, 1960, think factories, transforming inputs into outputs, very mechanistic. The new economy, it's autonomously recognizing things. My bank recognizes my voice. It says, oh yes, that's Arthur. Why? Am I sure? Etc. It recognizes, it decides, it acts, but all of this is conversational. The only word I could use here was organic, but maybe another word could be used, and that is alive. Why? Because it's an interaction among functionalities. It's not transforming physical inputs into physical outputs. It's actually more like a biological system, more like your brain or what's going on inside an individual cell with thousands of interactions, and then they're causing something to happen. How will society respond? This is under huge debate. The jobs issue, just to remind you of all of that, whole categories of jobs will disappear. Do I believe that? Absolutely, I do. And I don't know any economists who would disbelieve that. I remember being at a conference and I said computation's getting rid of huge numbers of jobs. And some guy, this was in Sweden, his hand went up and he said, I do not believe that. He said, computers have never wiped out a single job. And I'm sitting there thinking, you know, oh, okay. Do we still have lift operators, elevator operators? I mean, that went out in the 50s, etc. So my only response is you should get out a little bit more. So the jobs issue, the example we're always given, but it's a good example, is that radiographers are on the endangered list. Artificial intelligence, the kind of intelligence I'm talking about here, can look at all the pixels, say brain scan, brain cancer, or it could be breast scan or any other organ, and now outcompete the very best radiologists at image recognition and associating that, notice the association again, with some incipient disease. So yes, jobs are under threat. The other knee-jerk reaction is, well, you know, we've had that before. Agricultural jobs went out, but everybody got re-employed. And I like the waggish example that Vasily Leontiev came up with this in the 1980s, but it's not popular with Brunholz and Andy McAfee. And they point out that in New York City there were 110,000 horses in 1900. The automobile and the truck came along. 20 years later, went down to close to zero. Jobs for horses haven't come back. You say, well, we're not horses. To which I say, nay. Anyway, so also I want to point out that a great deal of job losses come from globalization, meaning the jobs all went to Mexico or Ireland or China, places like that. And that was not artificial intelligence or what I'm talking about, associative intelligence of machines. It was actually just hooking up via the internet and making it viable to have your supplier in somewhere like Shanghai, and you could be in Seattle, and everything is almost done in real time. So globalization is what hollowed out Middle America. It's too early to say if history will repeat, but I want to point out that, or at least my own take on this is to say, maybe we will have new jobs to offset the old ones, maybe not. Personally, I think there'll be so many jobs offset, and I don't want to demoralize people here at PARC, but there will be a lot, so we'll have to work hard to find new ones. What I would prefer to point out is we've reached something that I call the Keynes Point, John Maynard Keynes. 1930, Keynes writes this essay. Now, if you're on the far side of the political spectrum, don't get upset. I have to warn American audiences about this. This is Keynes just sort of late at night. What Keynes pointed out was around now, in the time of his grandchildren, which would be around now, he thought that the British economy would have produced enough for everyone, roughly. There's never enough for everyone. but it would have produced enough, so the production problem would be solved with huge quotation marks. But very likely there'd be technological employment. He wrote this in 1930. The whole idea of robots was 3 years old by then. But Keynes had noticed the robots. Is this true? Yeah. If you take US household income earned by all households divided by the number of households, you come up with $73,000. So the trough, in principle, is big enough for all the piggies. The question is, how are the piggies going to get to the trough if they don't have jobs? So what I'm saying is that we are entering, a la Keynes, or in my opinion, a new era, where the emphasis is not so much on production, the more produced, the better, always, but the emphasis is on getting to the trough. Can we all get to the trough? And the way to get to that the last 200 years has been jobs. It's very important to notice that jobs are new. If you go back 400 years ago, I don't know if you know your ancestors, they didn't all have jobs. They were apprentices in a guild. They were farm workers. They might have had farms. They might have had possessions. They might have had inherited wealth. But of course there were jobs. There were people who were scribes. They'd write letters for you. There were people who were teachers. But it wasn't like the standard job economy. So what's important, I believe, in the future, the near future, is not so much jobs, but how do we get access to the trough, to the larger economy, if all these technologies I'm talking about are going to wipe out a lot of jobs? And my immediate answer to that is that's under a lot of debate at the moment among economists, but it bears a lot of thinking about. I want to say a couple of words here, and that is, in a distributive era, if the big theme at the moment is who gets what, then the rules of the economy change. If you're saying we want more economic growth and production, how are we going to achieve that? That's a job for engineers and entrepreneurs. And that's been very well looked after the last 50 years, the last 300 years or so. If you want more distribution, that's a job for society and for politics. It immediately becomes political. And it's not very far from that statement to say that if we're in a distributive era, then things become political. And it's not very far to point out that that's why the Italian government is populist, the Hungarian government is populist, the German government is having trouble with being standard. I won't say anything about the American government. I'm here on a green card. But I do want to point out that the essential problem of society has become distribution, and that's a political problem. Free market solutions don't work that well. Now, I'm not sure they ever work that well, but free market solutions, and I'm thinking of Milton Friedman type solutions that are beloved of certain people in this economy, emphasize growth and production. But that's not the game anymore. It's who gets what. And so free market solutions aren't going to go away, but I think they are not working as well because, okay, well, let's have free market solutions. We'll have all this trade with Mexico and trade with China. Oops, sorry, that's wiped out a great number of middle-class workers in the American Midwest. So this is going to go on for several decades. GDP is no longer a good measure. Imagine an economy where everything is done autonomously. So you wake up in the morning and all these algorithms are serving you coffee, and your car pulls up, it's driving you to work. Work has disappeared, by the way, so you're going to Pete's coffee shop. and you're very well looked after, etc. But none of that's priced, because this is all autonomous, so it's sort of all laid on you. Therefore, there's no GDP. GDP is the volume of goods sold times their price. But there aren't goods in this thought experiment. There's no prices, there's no GDP. This is extreme. But it does mean that if we're all using email instead of paying for postage stamps, email isn't counted in GDP. It doesn't cost very much at all. Stamps cost a lot. GDP has gone down. It's not a good measure. There's a host of challenges I should talk about, but I want to just mention one of them, because I think this is going to be the key challenge. By the way, I am all for technological progress. I'm an engineer, just like many people in the audience. If I look at the history of the Industrial Revolution, and if I look at my own family records, it's amazing. I'll just say in the American case. If you were born in this country in 1900, your life expectancy was 40 years. 100 years later, 120 years later, it's now 80 years. That is due to better medicine. More than anything, it's due to better sanitation, clean water, better environment, healthier. We don't all get tuberculosis and die. We're well fed, we're well looked after. So I'm all for progress. But as progress goes on, we have to keep adjusting to it. And I'll come to the adjustment that needed to be made in the Industrial Revolution in a moment. But I'm thinking that, yes, there might be job problems. There might be problems of privacy. There might be problems of who owns all this data. There might be problems. But one of the worst problems, this is just myself, is I get up in the morning and I have my autonomous Jeeves, Siri, or whatever it's going to be, maybe a female voice. And you're not feeling well today, Brian. When do you want to be driven to work? And I say, I don't think I'm going to work at all. I wouldn't advise that, Brian. I think you really should show up. So we might have these artificially intelligent servants not only advising us, but telling us what to do, telling us where to go, noting where we are, telling us that we haven't phoned granddad in the last 2 weeks or something. Do we want that? I don't know. Me, I'm in no rush for this. Although maybe there's plenty good to be said about it. What I do think is that as human beings, what we really need is challenge and meaning that our lives are very, our lives actually count. What we're doing counts. So if all of this artificial intelligence sort of says, well, you know, we've all the comfort we want. It's like that, what was the movie, with the cute little robot and everybody was sitting in deck chairs? WALL-E. Yeah, so there could be a WALL-E world where we're all looked after and we're binge watching television and we're drinking martinis or whatever. But I don't think that's quite what we want as human beings. I think what we want is a bit of challenge, things that we need to resolve and solve, and meaning. And we've got our meaning these days more out of jobs and family than anything else. And I think this is going to be a huge question. And I think that we're going to see two things. We're going to see a big push forward into what can be done in the economic sphere. How can we use all this external intelligence? It's fantastic. How are we going to use it personally? For example, you can't do gene sequencing very well without computation. In fact, it wouldn't exist without plenty of computation. And I find a few months ago I did my ancestry, nothing terribly surprising. My father had told me my grandfather was hanged for horse stealing and his grandfather for horse stealing. And I found out that that was probably the case. But it's amazing what this sort of external intelligence will be doing for us. But I also forecast there'll be a push back. And the reaction is that I think we're going to see far more movements to do with meaning. Maybe more of us will be doing Zen meditation. I think that's already happened in California in the last 50 years. But above all, we're going to see the rise of a philosophy of meaning, a philosophy of humanism. So humanism is that, yes, human beings count. Well, what is it about human beings count? Well, we're human. We love each other, we can write novels, we can hear music, and so on. The machines can't do that, not yet, anyway. So there will be two things. How are we going to use all this wonderful stuff? And then how are we going to react to it? And I think what I'm going to forecast is that we will see decade by decade more on the philosophy of meaning. In fact, I see now in universities that all the engineering departments are going to say we need to make human beings out of our engineers. I'm not quite kidding. So let me finish up with comparison, and that's Britain in the 1850s. I was thinking, how does this situation compare? Take the Industrial Revolution. By 1850 in Britain, the Industrial Revolution was roaring. The railways were being built. We had the telegraph. We had textile factories, steam engines. People had decent nutrition for the first time. They had clothes that they could afford. They weren't just in rags. And I'm thinking about England. If you were in England, things were starting to improve very rapidly. But then if you look on the other side, there were huge challenges. Women were working down mines. Women and children were in the mills putting in 14-hour days. Safety regulations were virtually non-existent, etc. So here's my illustration of this. That probably is around 1850. I found this on the internet, and all you have to do is look at one face after another, including the one of the bastard sort of guy who's in charge. This was around 1850, probably in England, and that's what things looked like. So yes, there were marvelous things that happened, and indeed people were much better off. But what I want to point out was that to get from here, say, to the 1950s, took a century. And it took a century not of governments improving things, but of individuals improving things. People who were concerned with society, Lord this and Lord that, which surprised me, peers that were looking and passing safety regulations, doctors and nurses, suffragists, all kinds of people saying it doesn't have to be this way. We can have all the bounty of what's coming production-wise, and we can make sure we have a decent society. What I want to point out is two things. It took decades. It was initially 30, 40 years before things like this improved. By the 1900s, it was much better and different. And by about the 1950s and 60s, it started to get very good in Europe, and similarly here. But it took decades for the adjustment to be made. And the adjustment wasn't led by the politicians. The adjustment was led by individuals who said, we need to think about all of this. And if these technologies are so wonderful, if we have steam engines and textile mills and railways, why isn't everybody better off? And over a period of decades and centuries, they made sure that happened. I think we're in a similar situation, maybe not as dire, but it's going to be a huge amount of an adjustment. And I think that along with the technology that is to me so sparkling and so amazing and so wonderful, we need an equal and opposite debate as to how human beings are going to fare in a world like this, and how will we thrive in that sort of world. Thank you.
Thank you. Very, very provocative talk. We have time for a few questions.
So thank you very much. Really, really great. So I've thought for decades now about the printing revolution, and I'd be curious what your thoughts are about the Gutenberg Bible, because it came about 90 years before Copernicus. And then my other question, you can pick one or both, is what are your thoughts on black boxes today in AI and society accepting that they're just weighted cost functions? And that, so we come up with this term explainable AI,
Yeah.
but let's see.
Okay, what was your question about the Gutenberg Bible?
Your thoughts on the role it played in all of
What I was really pointing out was not so much that the Bible was translated into German and printed, which was quite remarkable, by the way, and printed in Latin to start off with. And this was quite remarkable. But for me, it wasn't so much what was printed, whether it was the Bible or something else. What the printing revolution brought us was something very deep and subtle. It was that individuals could absorb knowledge. They could do it on their own. They didn't have to be part of the clergy. They didn't have to be part of a hierarchy. They didn't even have to have permission. And they could debate that among themselves. And more than anything, that's the hallmark of Western modernity. Thoughts like that, you could see where Thomas Jefferson comes out of that tradition, and in turn that brought us modern version of democracy. As to, I think you're alluding that a lot of artificial intelligence is in black boxes. We know, for example, you might come up with an algorithm that learns to lip read, and that algorithm is maybe many layers deep neural net. You don't know how it lip reads, you just know it works. My immediate reaction to that is welcome to the modern world. I remember 10 years or more ago, I went down to Google. The CTO and Google, Chief Technology Officer, said, "Oh, we have such and such an algorithm. Should we do something different?" I don't know what it was for. It could have been their basic search engine 10 or 15 years ago. I said, yeah, there's a different way to do it. I said you could do it by figuring out what works, feeding in all the inputs, and then just training the system. I was thinking of things like the genetic algorithm, but other sorts of algorithms. Training the system to recognize what works. This is the way we would do it nowadays. He balked, maybe rightly. He said, "Are you telling me we should bet all of Google's prime proprietary functionality on something that we don't understand how it works?" And I said, yes. So I think that my answer to your question is, yeah, these things are black boxes. We don't understand exactly how they work because we're just saying, throw in English here, you get Chinese out there. They work, they don't always work very well, and we don't quite know how they work. I just think that's the way it's going to be. We're in a different, a new world.
Hi. So I'm also interested in this printing question as well. So when we moved, as you pointed out, from the knowledge, received knowledge coming from a particular institution and owned by them, going to being now, if you will, owned by the public at large, ready to debate. So therefore, it was less received knowledge. So now what I'm concerned about is that we're living in an age of fake news and lots of fakeness, and certainly not everything in those books, Copernicus maybe aside, but not everything in those books was quote unquote true. Are we in a period now where we are going to redefine truth again, because we're now going to, so we do have some received knowledge, but there's going to be a lot of people evaluating quote unquote truth going forward.
Well, again, if you go back to about 1520 when Martin Luther was putting out pamphlets, and I've looked at some of these, and you know, the picture of the Pope as a pig who's eating pig swill and so on. I don't think that's quite the truth in the Vatican at that stage. There was an awful lot of fake news, and there has been through history. So what happens is, it seems to me, I'm just conjecturing on the spot, but what happens is a new medium comes up, meaning a new means of producing information. Lots of good information is produced and debated, and lots of nonsense and bad information is produced. And I think it takes a decade or two for institutions to readjust. What I like at the moment is that I can see the glimmerings of new institutions coming up saying, okay, we're going to rate the news. And I would gladly subscribe to some sort of news outlet that would say, I'm only going to send you news that's rated. Of course it'll make mistakes. So again, I keep coming back to the same theme. I may not be correct on this, but what I think is correct is, if you want to figure out the future, it's not different from the past for a really deep reason. That is that human beings haven't changed their behavior. The technology changes, but we're the same people. We get excited, we want truth, we want depth, we want philosophy, we want nonsense, we want entertainment, we want to be selfish. And we use all these means in the same way. And the important thing is whether, of all the technologies I'm talking about, the one thing I've learned is the technologies don't just get adopted. You could say they do, maybe, but they don't just get adopted and 5 years later things are different. There's an encounter between these huge technologies and society and industry and businesses, and that encounter works its way out over decades. And the people who make money in this encounter are not always the people who develop the technology. They're the people who own the structures. If you could own blockchain or that sort of technology and make it proprietary, then you can make a lot of money. If you come up with a new technology that rapidly becomes a commodity, like how to recognize faces, it's a bit harder to make money. But it's good to be in the vanguard of all of this, I would certainly say.
We'll take two more questions. I think there was one here and then one here and then, okay.
Thanks very much for the clarity of your talk. I'm one of those AI scientists that you were mentioning, and I'm particularly interested in how the programs, the models that I and my colleagues build will advance the future of science as a whole.
Yeah.
So I'm interested in, first of all, your speculations about that, because you have a very broad view. And I'm also interested in whether you think that the what you correctly named the associational methods of current AI will be able to achieve that versus the model-based reasoning methods that you thought AI was going to be all about, and I thought AI was going to be all about, and somehow it didn't turn out that way.
Yeah.
Will they be enough? Will the associational methods be enough? And
No.
will science even accept them?
Yeah. Talking about history, about 30 years ago when I was new at Stanford, a friend of mine brought me over to the, I think it was the computer science department, and into an office, and that office was completely dark. I remember it was like a huge cavern, and the very, very end of it was a green screen. Computers were green in those days, and dark and with green letters, and hunched over it was a figure, and my friend brought me up to this man, and he said, he introduced me, and he said, by the way, this is John McCarthy. McCarthy was the man, as you would know, who thought up the term artificial intelligence. There's a beautiful book, again by this man, Douglas Robertson, called Phase Change. And the book's now out of print, but it might have been 10 years ago. I was fascinated with this book. What Robertson does is he takes one science after another, and he shows how computation has completely and irreversibly changed that science. What surprised me most of all was mathematics. There are people who do, my answer to your question is, yes, we will still have reasoning, we will still have model-based reasoning, we will still have logic, we will still have science. But in one science after another, there's now a parallel path that's using computation as an exploratory tool. It's like it's a little space module. You can get into your computer, maybe if you're doing topology, you can say, I'm going to explore this space using what's called exploratory mathematics or experimental mathematical models. We don't quite know how it works, but we're going to conjecture. Again, there's historical precedent for that because there are a lot of people in the 1600s and 1700s, really good mathematicians, like Euler or Gauss, or before that, people like Wallace or Newton. And what they used to explore was pencil and paper. And often they would hire computers, meaning people who did computations, and they would explore these things for themselves. So there's always been this sort of exploring by computing, by just looking at the numbers and trying to figure things out. One of my favorite quotes, by the way, is, I ran across this in the London Science Museum. There's a quote from Charles Babbage, and he was talking to Jonathan Herschel. Herschel's dad had discovered Neptune. Jonathan Herschel was a very good mathematician. Babbage was Babbage, 1821. And they're both trying to check logarithmic tables, probably for the British Navy, seeing where the accurate about every fourth entry was wrong, had just been computed wrong. And finally, Babbage got fed up and he says, I wish to God, he said, these things had been computed by steam. So steam was the big technology of the day. And that really was one of the very early impetuses by having computers. Can we explore into the world using computation? The answer is yes, of course. But I'm old-fashioned. I want to see, like you, that there will still be plenty of room for human conjecture, human thought. I believe both will continue to be in parallel, but computation's getting ever more important. One of the fastest converging series for computing pi was discovered by a computer about 15 years ago. And within about 6 terms of that series, you can get pi to maybe 50 or 100 decimal places. So humans are getting a run for their money, but we have I like the idea that we have these time machines or little capsules that we can call computers. We can step into that and explore. But there's still a sense of wonder that we have that the machines don't have yet.
Yes. Thank you so much for weaving together a history and future of society, economics, religion as well. Looking forward into the future, who's going to be the real kings? Who's going to really own all of this great wealth? When I look here in Silicon Valley, there's billionaires on the other side of the freeway, but in San Francisco, there's homeless encampments everywhere. Is that a nod to the future? Is it going to be split between who owns the AI? Or is it the tech companies that own AI and they have all the power? What is your view on the future of the economy and society?
I don't know. I think that I'd put on my, let me just say there's a really good economist who worked in London, who I won't name, came originally from Germany and in the 1850s, 1860s, or to reveal someone, Karl Marx, and he worried a lot about, basically his idea was that each new means of production, each new era in the economy would bring a new set of politics. What I'm saying is that the immediate coming era, to the degree it's about distribution, then that has to do with fairness, but it also has to do with fear. Fear that you're not going to get enough, that immigrants are going to come in and they're going to get to the trough and so on. So for the near future, if my analysis is correct, we're going to see a lot of this sort of populist, localized politics. And just look at Hungary if you want, put up barbed wire against all those immigrants so they couldn't pass through Hungary, etc. Beyond that, I don't know. All I can tell you is that I don't think it's who owns the data that will count. I think what I would expect to happen in this 50 years, I'm not sure I will see that, but in 50 years' time, I think there will be movements that say, we're human beings. We refuse, it's like science fiction movies, we refuse to be made into clients of computation. We refuse to be made into automata ourselves. If you look at Star Wars, and just finish on this note, if you look at Star Wars, the early movie, turns out that the good guys have technology, and the bad guys have technology. The bad guys have the Death Star, and they're all in white, meaning they're all identical. They're clones. Those are the bad guys. The good guys are individualistic. They don't even talk very well. They hang out at the Mos Eisley Cantina, and they talk like, and they have to kick their starships or whatever they're called to get them started. They have the technology. But why are they full of human traits like Chewbacca, supposed to be sort of half dog? Why are they weird? One of them even says, in the middle of space, this damn starship isn't working. Let's get out and push. But why? The answer is because what's going to be valued, or what is valued, is human expression. Difference, eccentricity, color, and above all, will. We're going to will ourselves to overcome what is the death. It's not physical death, it's the death of will. We're not going to be made into these automata. So the politics, I think, of 50 years' time will be these forces of making us clones versus a huge reaction saying, we're human beings and we're going to assert that. Whoever can lead in a benign way, not a fear way, but coming from real strength, will have a huge following in that.
On that note, thank you very much for